Well, thank you, Debbie. The problem about being introduced by somebody who knew you when you were 1 year old is that you stand on this stage feeling like you're about 8. But it's fantastic to be here. So as Debbie said, I'm the CEO of Interbrand in the US. And those of you that know Interbrand may know that we publish a ranking of the world's most valuable brands, best global brands. And what I'm going to share with you today is a sort of perspective on how the future of brands, topic of this conference, is being shaped, and some of the trends and learnings that we can mine from that 20 years of data that can perhaps give a perspective as to what we should all be doing as brand owners as we move into this next decade. So let's start by thinking about what can we learn from 20 years of brand successes and failures. So that ranking we've been doing for 20 years, I think there are 37 brands that are still on the list. So 178 have come and gone during those 20 years. So there's lots to be learned from what has been successful. But let's start by looking back at another major moment in history, which is last year was the 50th anniversary of landing man on another planet. And it's something that lives in our collective consciousness, sort of indelibly linked. Many of us, any of us that are old enough, can sort of vaguely remember it back in 1967. So it is very much a part of everybody's memory. But what's interesting is if you go back to 1961, John F. Kennedy standing in front of Congress, making a commitment that within the decade, America would have had a man on the moon and return him safely there. Michael Collins was the third man on the Apollo 11 mission. He didn't actually land on the moon. He captained the command module. But when he was asked to recall what happened during the Apollo mission just last year, he made an interesting comment, and I'm going to share with you. Well, or not. And is there sound from this? No? If I go back, will there be sound? No, clearly not. Yeah, he was, everybody can read hand sign. Okay, I'm going to go back and do it again. If you can just turn the sound up a little bit.
As the months went by, I thanked John F. Kennedy more and more because the stark simplicity of his mandate was wonderful for us. We could quote John Kennedy and we could get things done. We could accelerate people. We tell people we've got to have this by day after tomorrow. The Kennedy mandate, the simplicity of it, the stark beauty of it, really helped us along to the moon.
So that Kennedy mandate, that simple ambition that was set by John F. Kennedy to get a man on the moon, was what propelled 400,000 people for a decade under what was probably the most harsh competitive environment that any of us could face during the Cold War to succeed on this mission. And it was that combination of a sort of long-term vision and short-term flexibility was what enabled this achievement to be made real. So how does that fit with brands? Well, brands are still incredibly potent, powerful forces. If we were to take the value of that 100 brands on Interbrand's list, it was a little under $1 trillion back in 1999, and it's about $2.1 trillion worth of value as of last year. So a significant increase. But there's no doubt that the means by which those brands are built today is incredibly different from what it was back in 1999. And there are 4 key forces that we see as driving that change. The first is a huge abundance of choice. In any category you're in, B2C, B2B, it doesn't matter. The barrier to entry for any competitor to move into your space is incredible, incredibly low. So we see this incredible proliferation of competitors within any category. And for customers, the ease with which they can dabble in a new brand has never been easier. Click of a button and you can try something. If you don't like it, you can send it back. So the idea that therefore loyalty, and we all know this, any of us that are in, especially in the B2C space, the notion of loyalty is diminishing at great speed. It used to be that if you could manage to continue to deliver to your customers' expectations, they would stay with you. Whereas now, unless you are able to delight them beyond belief, then they will move somewhere else. And the whole notion of loyalty, I would argue, is something which customers don't want anymore. Loyalty means doing the same thing you've always done, whereas people want different things. They want novelty and newness. So it's interesting to know that I think 90% of CPG brands are seeing share declines of the top brands. So it's an era where trying to manage loyalty is extremely difficult. Subscription services, changing the notion of what loyalty means. Look at the Gillette story and Harry's Club and Dollar Shave Club. They used to fight over half-point shares, declines and increases, and they lost 20 share points in the space of, 5-10 years. So it's a very different dynamic to what it was a number of years ago. One of the other things that's driving that is the speed of adoption of technology. So we all know that obviously, as Debbie said, innovation and change is constant. But what I think is interesting here, and it's a little spidery chart, but what it shows is the speed with which consumer electronics products were taken up by the population. So if you go back to the early part of the 20th century, it took sort of 60 years before the vacuum cleaner became 100% of households had one, whereas now, the tablet, within 4 years, 50% of the population have tablets. So the speed with which that adoption is taking place is accelerating beyond belief. And the final force is this shifting frames of references. So it used to be that people went into a category to buy something with a view of other competitors within that category. Now what you're seeing is people bring in, because of technology, how they are able to do things in other categories. So if you're going to buy a mortgage, you expect it to be as easy as creating a Spotify playlist. You don't expect it to be reams of paperwork and endless confusion and complexity. So what you see as best in class from one category is what you bring into your experience with a category that you're about to shop. So what does all this mean? It means that ultimately, customer expectations are moving way faster than most companies can keep up. If you're a legacy business, unpicking the way in which you have been serving your customers for the previous 50, 100 years, whatever it may be, you have to unwind that and find a way to be able to do that at a speed which is incredibly difficult for most companies, with disruptors coming into the category, constantly forcing you to reassess how you're managing your business. So if you look back, it used to be possible if you were just to sort of renovate the core of your business and your brand, you would be able to keep close to meeting customer expectations. But what we're finding now is if you just renovate the core, over time, you're just getting further and further away from them. So what successful brands are doing is they're making these transformative changes, bold moves that completely reframe how a customer perceives the category. And that is what we can learn from the last 5 to 10 years of success from companies within that Best Global Brands report. So we call these iconic moves. And they're moves because they physically alter the competitive landscape, and they're iconic because they're exciting and they capture the imagination of customers. They get people to think about a category in a very different way. So if these are successful, what do they do? Well, the first is they create a new normal. So any of you who are old enough to have been flying in business class prior to 2000 will know that you used to sit in a seat, maybe a big, large, comfy seat, but nonetheless a seat. And then British Airways created the flatbed in 2000, 2001. And from that moment on, your perspective of business class travel had changed. If you got on a plane and it had a seat, you thought you were being hard done by because that was what you expected. They completely changed what customer expectation was within the business class travel section. The second thing they do is they force internal change. Now, you may think this is a strange one, but all-day breakfast at McDonald's was indeed an iconic move. Steve Easterbrook, who was the CEO at the time, had this vision that he was going to bring all-day breakfast to the McDonald's franchisees. This is something that they had tried for years and had been hugely rejected because the complexity of operating two different product lines at the same time through a McDonald's store is surprisingly incredibly difficult. But Steve had this bold vision. This was what he believed was going to transform some of the fate of McDonald's. And he managed to force through the system, because of this, the power of the idea that he had, to force the franchisees and the operators to figure out how to be able to deliver this, and was very successful. And it was a major part of the turnaround of McDonald's. The other thing iconic moves do is create a temporary monopoly. So disruptors do this all the time. So if you're Uber, or Uber came into the taxi market, of course, they create a temporary monopoly. Until other rideshare companies are able to get into the market, Uber is in a category of one. But also, major brands can do this. When Apple doubled down on retail in 2013, they are still, I would argue to this day, a category of one in luxury electronics retail. And Microsoft and Samsung are sort of trying to catch up in that space. But the reality is nobody quite does it like Apple does it. And they own that market and that place in customers' minds. And the final thing then is, when they do it right, they drive extraordinary business results. The Lego movie was phenomenal iconic move for Lego. It grossed $500 million, so it was very successful as a movie franchise. But it also, post the launch of the first movie, there was a 25% increase in Lego sales. So this was a transformative change for the future of the Lego business. So if you think, we all talk about brands being stories, and if brands are stories, then iconic moves are the chapters in those stories. Amazon is one of the fastest growing brands on Best Global Brands. It's had this year last year was a 24% growth. The previous year it was a 40% growth. And what you see if you look back is it's punctuated by these iconic moves, whether that was the launch of Prime back in 2005, the launch of Kindle in 2007, the launch of Alexa in 2014, and the purchase of Whole Foods in 2018. Each of these has helped to shape the growth trajectory of the Amazon brand. So what does this all mean for brands that are or any of us are owning and managing brands? The dogma of positioning has been the terminology that has been used by all of us across the course of the last X number of years to try and define the role that a brand plays in the world. But in our view, that now doesn't seem to fit when you think about the nature of the speed with which things are changing and the need to make these iconic moves in order to stay ahead of customer expectations. So why does it not work? Three key things. First is the world's moving too fast. So by the time you've spent your weeks and months delving into your customer and thinking about your competitive set and coming out with a positioning and then allowing that positioning to trickle down through the organization and actually alter the customer experience, the world's already moved on. Things move too quick. And you're going to constantly playing catch up to try to ensure that your brand shows up in the right way, in a most meaningful way. The second thing is that customers don't see brands anymore. Sorry, they don't see categories anymore. They see brands. So it used to be that positioning was about sort of creating a moat within your competitive set, within your category. What were you going to do to defend yourself against a particular positioning? Whereas now what we're seeing is successful brands are building bridges to other categories. Apple's movement into financial services is a good example of that. So brands now have to capture and embody a core idea, whether it's sort of creativity that's the heart of Apple, or think about Amazon. What category is Amazon in? Is it in the media business? Is it in the retail business? Is it in the business services business? I mean, it's in all of those businesses, and its guiding force is the notion of customer obsession. So the idea at the heart of Amazon can then be applied to any category that it chooses to go into. And the final thing is that customers no longer distinguish between the brand and the business and the leadership. These are all have to be intertwined. You can't create the brand out here in an external world and then have the business and leadership work in a different way. So if you were to think about the issues that Facebook are facing at the moment, is that a brand problem? Is that a business problem? Is it a leadership problem? It's all three. Those things are indelibly linked. And for iconic moves to be successful, they have to tick each of those boxes. If you're not able to change the experience for your customer, if you can't be seen as a trustworthy business building relationships with its customers, and you can't create the perception of what delivering to customer needs, then you're not going to be successful. So positioning as it was, was interestingly very sort of static language. If you think about all of the language of brand building, brand architecture, brand houses, brand pillars, values that you stand for. These are all things that were like never changed. So we believe that that has got to evolve. The language has got to evolve around how brands are built if we're going to, in this world that we now live in. So we think about brands having trajectories. So it's a much more dynamic, it's not static, it's thinking about how are you constantly fluid and flexible and moving with your customers and with competitive sets. How are you reflecting not just the brand but the customer and the business? How is that in lockstep changing the way your brand is showing up in the market? And you are led by the experience, you're not defined by the category. So we think of it almost like 5G branding. The old world of positioning was sort of 4G. We're now moving into a new world of 5G branding where everything is more dynamic and flexible. So it's not just fancy new words. It's not just saying, oh, now we're going to stop calling things positionings and start calling them trajectories and they're all identical. It is a different way of thinking about how we build brands. And we do a survey of CMOs every few years. And when we ask them, what are the key things that you think are success factors for you in terms of driving the business growth? The first is we need to understand what the needs and wants and desires are of our customers and what we're going to address and what they're going to be in the future and how we're going to address them. And then we think about, well, what are the interactions that we're going to create in order to deliver those expectations? And then what the business model is that will enable them to deliver those returns. And those are the three tenets that we think are critical to be successful in this new 5G world. You need to understand the future of your customer, the human truth. You need to shape the experiences, not just talk about the messaging and the communications. And you need to think about the business model. Because a lot of the times now, as marketers, a lot of the CMOs I talk to, are much more involved in shaping especially the service layer, service design, the experience that comes from the brand. It's not about just shaping communications and messaging. It's about actually how are people going to interact with the company going forward? What are those experiences? And therefore, they have to be informed by the brand, but they are very much the purview of the CMO to be able to deliver that. So if you start by setting an ambition, everything, as we know from John F. Kennedy, you have to have that inspiring purpose that aggregates every constituency for the brand, the internal constituencies, the external constituencies. Every stakeholder group needs to be galvanized around a core purpose. And then we think about what the initial departure point is. So let's look at the current status quo through the lens of human truths, through the current experiences, through the current economics of the business. How is money being generated for that brand today? And then we think, what is the trajectory? And this is sort of a midterm ambition that, again, says, well, what's the future state going to look like? What do we expect experiences to be in the future? How are we going to make money in the future? And then through a series of small I moves, sort of small I innovation moves, and iconic moves, you plot your way to get to that trajectory. And sort of like GPS navigation, that's constantly flexing as customer trends come in and category dynamics change, those trajectories evolve. You don't set them and then just move in that direction. You have to constantly be reacting to that. So it is that combination of long-term thinking and short-term flexible action that will enable a brand to succeed. And it's no different to what was probably the world's most iconic move of getting the man on the moon, which also required that same long-term commitment and short-term action. So with that, I thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.